Hello everybody and welcome to HT2201, Theories of Contemporary Architecture. And our theme today, Ecologies of Excess. We're going to depart from the idea of the body, or multiple bodies, as the origin points of ecologies. Ecologies which take in multiple species and multiple concepts and frameworks of space itself, space, environment, ecology. We're going to access these big concepts through the origin point of the body. And by looking at the construction of the body, single bodies, hybrid bodies especially, bodies containing multiple species, multiple ontologies. We're going to depart from that body and look to see if we play with the body, if we re-engineer the body, mutate it, hybridize it, multiplicate it, what happens then to its spatial requirements? What happens to its environmental requirements? What happens to its architectural habitat? And if we rethink the body away from normative, generic standards of what it means to be human and what it means to be an isolated human, if we move away from that idea to much more radical conceptions of what a body is and all the different other kinds of body and species and entity that it's intertwined with, can we get to a more complete, a more powerful, and ultimately a more ecological and life-giving, life-sustaining formulation of architecture? So that's our task, and we're going to begin with a performance. Now, the body, or how the body is, whether it's a human or a non-human body, whether it's cyborgian, meaning whether it's been hybridized with machine parts or electrical systems or prostheses, alien chemistries, whether it's a single body or a multiplicity of bodies, these all factor into and implicate the body in different kinds of spatial condition and different kinds of environment that involve other species, other atmospheres, other landscapes, and other ecologies. Every body exists somewhere, but nobody exists alone where it exists. And nobody, especially no human body, is a naturally given entity, but is always to some extent constructed or assembled. It's not just given in some fundamentally natural way. It's always the product of construction and assemblage. Now, in 2020, at the beginning of the pandemic, when the SCI-Arc end-of-year show, spring show, was curated, one of the tasks of that creation of a virtual space was to populate it with inhabitants, meaning, of course, mostly students. And that meant having to kind of create bodies, to design the figure of the inhabitant of that space, and to try and do that by covering the body, or covering the kind of normative body rigs that you find available online for populating digital spaces, whether they're architectural models or game worlds. And they're highly restrictive, they're highly normative in the way that they represent the way that the body is, the kind of body shape that there is, the gendering of the body. And they all kind of signify a standard way of existence, which we felt didn't correspond at all to the kind of creative life that happens inside SCI-Arc. So one of the first and major activities of that work was to redesign the body. And this meant covering the body, kind of assembling it with the things that it created, with digital assets, chunks of digital models, post-humanizing the body by extending it into its surroundings, into its environment, and showing through this assemblage that the body is kind of defined by external systems, by its particular modes of production, by its extensions, by its prostheses, by the mechanical and digital systems which that body exists in. Now, within conventional, canonical histories of architecture, the centering of the body is a traditional starting point. And you probably will have seen, especially this image on the left, before Leonardo's very well-known 1490 image of Vitruvian Man. And it's called Vitruvian Man after Vitruvius, the author of one of the earliest published architectural treatises, first kind of theories of architecture, or practical handbooks for architecture. And there's a lot in that book, very influential text within the history of architecture, on the body as being an ideal set of geometries and proportions from which broader spatial structures, broader architectural structures can be extrapolated. So the body can be measured, it can be situated within these ideal geometrical figures. And that assures a kind of perfect correspondence between the physical constitution of the human and the spaces which it inhabits. And you see other architectures going so far as to look at the contours of the profile of a face and use that as a template for defining the silhouette of a building. And by choosing different characters, whether that's kind of rugged and aged or smoother and younger, that human anthropomorphic character would get transferred onto the architectural project itself. And there are many examples of this attempt to squeeze, and it's always an attempt because the fit never seems quite right, to squeeze the body into the plan or the kind of essential geometry of a building. Here, an attempt to inscribe the body in a church. And you see that schematic, geometrical, proportional system developed in body measurement, projected onto, in this case, the facade of a cathedral. Now, needless to say, these body-centered architectural experiments of the kind of Renaissance and neoclassical period were highly exclusionary. They inserted some bodies and they excluded other bodies. They relied on stereotypical ideas about what constitutes an ideal body, and furthermore, they individualized the body. They put the origin of architecture in a single body, a heroic body, excluding thereby the multiple nature of bodies, the communal nature of bodies. And obviously the fact that these are all male bodies is a sign of their exclusionary nature, the fact that they belong to one culture, one race, shows you that if you were to look further into these histories, you would find that this theory of the human and its corresponding theory of architecture were highly limited and in some ways violently exclusionary of the full diversity, not only of human but of non-human life. Well, what if we zoom out in time and cultural context and look now at more contemporary and radical, future-oriented conceptions of the human. And we're looking here at the collages of Wangechi Mutu, contemporary artist. And you see an absolutely radically different attitude to the conception of the body and what it means really to be alive. Because the bodies here are really not a single body, they're a multiplicity of bodies. They're chimerical. They contain many different species. You see the outline of avian species, of mammalian species. You see shellfish, insects, as well as completely non-biological forms of mechanism. So part of an engine, brought in electrical wiring, mechanicals, some kind of epidermal chemistry. And so the being, the living being, is a composite being, assembled out of many different fragments and prostheses from different species. There's even a sense in which the conventional contour of the human face, or kind of a mammal's body, gets to be replaced by these really animated kind of vegetal or insectidal kind of worm-like forms, which in Wangechi Mutu's work become the kind of principal bearers of life. See another one here with a dolphin head, part human bodies, radically different scalar shifts between elements of the bodies, and always this implication of mechanical or cyborgian limbs or elements which constitute life itself. And one could go a long way with this. You know, of the many other kinds of contemporary examples of figures, artists, models, people in fashion, radical cultural actors who are actively engaged in the process of redesigning the human. So here we have materiales fecales, or fecal matter. You can see them, Instagram is one of their primary outlets, in which almost every aspect that one conventionally associates or normatively associates with a body is here redesigned. And you see here posing with their cats, Cunty, a hairless cat, that part of what this means is pushing the human, the concept of the human, away from its sort of heroic individualism and bringing it in contact instead with other species. And kind of highlighting and igniting these multi-species relationships. Arca and Arca's collaborations with the 3D designer Frederick Hyman, another example of this that perhaps pushes this this concept of body re-engineering with a special emphasis on the gendering of the body. So through mechanical, biotechnical prostheses, Arc as body is re-engineered, it's rewired, its evolutionary and reproductive capacities are re-engineered. And what emerges through this, often quite violent and physical act of cutting and splicing and adding and taking away, what emerges through this hard kind of labor is a non-binary body. And so part of this effort, part of this work, is to break down and re-engineer the conventional and in many ways highly limiting and non-diverse versions of human life, which restrict conception of self and constrict what versions of human society and community and in the end politics we're able to think of. I just highlight here the kind of deep history of these practices of body conversion, which are kind of, there's a trajectory here on the mirror board that you can follow if you wish. And it leads to the work which I won't speak about much here, but I put it here for reference. The important work of Jack Halberstam on unbuilding gender. To say that in that work, the kind of radical violence of breaking down a body in order to reconstitute it in a new ways is connected to the architectural destruction in the work of Gordon Matter Clark, who takes not so much a body, but in this case the environmental surround of a body, that is the house, and applies similar kinds of cosmetic re-engineering to the single-family home in order to disturb that space and produce an alternative realm in which life can flourish. Now, this idea of body re-engineering and of multi-species bodies as an origin for thinking about space, as an origin for thinking about architecture and what kinds of spaces we need to design and build to shelter these new versions of the human. We read this week the work of Donna Haraway on tentacular thinking. So let's go into this work. Now, our reason for reading Donna Haraway is to provide us with new models of life, new ways to describe and define life, and in doing so to come up, as it were, with new formulations of the client of architecture, the inhabitant of architecture, who architecture is for. And if we can get a more complicated and real version of the diversity of that inhabitant, or those inhabitants, those many, more than those many-dimensioned inhabitants of architecture, that will provide us with a better route to conceptualize architecture. Now, Haraway begins this work really with a critique of this idea of the Anthropocene. And this is an idea which, very dominant and in current thinking, taking its name from anthropos, the human, the idea that the current geological period that we live in, is dominated by the influence of anthropos, of the human, and therefore it should be called the Anthropocene. Haraway takes issue with this, and instead suggests that far from being individualized humans who dominate, we have to reconceptualize ourselves as part of these multi-species models. So a model being, a conglomeration of different life forms, of different species. And this produces a, in her language, kind of troublesome entanglement of different life forms. But this troublesome entanglement, this multi-species model, is what we have to get our heads around if we're to fully and accurately understand the forms of life which currently define our experience of being on the planet. And, Haraway does an interesting thing, which is that in the essay she refers, well, first of all to a spider, and then later on to various other kinds of species as kind of co-authors of her thinking, to immediately engage other species and the life of other species that she shares her life with on Earth, in order to think about the world, about Earth, about the environment, about space, in a way that includes the point of view of what she calls critters, like little animals. And this leads her, this way of thinking, leads to something that she refers to as tentacular thinking. And so this idea of tentacular thinking comes from the idea of the tentacle. Obviously, octopi have tentacles, these kind of sensory limbs that feel and try and sense out the world. And the tentacular is a property of kind of spiders or fingery beings, humans, raccoons, squid, jellyfish, neural extravaganzas, fibrous entities, snakes, creepers, swelling roots, all things which are linked together in nets and networks. And tentacularity becomes a way of living together, of producing a series of interlaced trails. And so tentacularity is a way of linking things together in nets and networks, linking the human to non-human species and those life forms together with vegetal and organic substances, so that nothing can really be separated from anything else. And that then provides a starting point for thinking about history, how to write history, who gets represented in history, who matters, who is valued, and who everything is even for. Now, clearly, for us, the interest of this conception is that it provides us with a new way of approaching space. And as I said before, like the client of architecture, the inhabitant of architecture, the various different kinds of agencies, which before were all excluded by the singular notion of the human. But now we can bring into our approach to building shelter and forms of spatial enclosure to promote coexistence. Let's look at what kinds of spatial situation we can get ourselves into. So this is what Haraway would certainly call a tentacular being that is engaged in an act of tentacular thinking. The octopus here is a tentacular being, and it spreads its network of feelers through and around space, and this gives it its own particular form of mobility, of circulation. And it can navigate with directions and kind of behavioral characteristics which are very different from the human. And because of that, it's able to exist within spaces that humans could never exist in. It has a way of squeezing and contorting its body, which allows it to circulate, as it were, in the interstices of space, the in-between spaces, the closed off and otherwise inaccessible worlds. Now, Haraway's kind of point, and I think our proposition here that we can depart from, is, well, what if we re-look at the history of architecture from a tentacular perspective? What if we try to look at, even within the history of human architecture, if we try to look at more kind of tentacular attitudes towards architecture? Can we find anything? And can that provide us with sort of departure point for rethinking what it is that we mean by architecture? Now, this may be familiar to you from our previous week. You may be able to identify that this is Friedrich Kiesler inside the Endless House, his great life's project. And you'll remember that the Endless House takes this squashed sphere shape. It's like an egg, a nest shape, like a burrow. And the model which we're looking at here is constructed out of this wire mesh that was in fact kind of realistic anticipation of its intended construction system, which would have been ferroconcrete. There's concrete poured over a very fine steel mesh, which enables it to take on these doubly curved surfaces, and when covered in plaster or cement, can produce really extraordinary interior perspectives, not unlike the glass octopus architecture that we were just looking at. And Kiesler is often photographed inhabiting this space as if he were himself a tentacular being, an invertebrate, a squid or an insect of some kind, who was building the shell of the architecture around himself, around his body, not imposing something from the outside, but instead feeling his way through space. Almost like a worm kind of burrowing through underground, putting his tentacles, putting his feelers through space in order to produce totally different kinds of surrounding environment. The floors and surfaces of the Endless House were intended not to be smooth, but to be rough, to have sand, pebbles, grass. There would be bathing pools. The windows were going to be curved, thermoformed plastic. The shell would be heated in parts to modulate the temperature. And we read part of Beatrice Colomina's work in which she touches on Friedrich Kiesler in X-ray architecture last week, noting how Kiesler spoke about the house as a human body. So the architecture itself is a living organism with the reactivity of a full-blooded creature, with organs, the stairs, the ventilation system, and a nervous system, and indeed a digestive system. A bodily system that, like any other kind of bodily organism, can also suffer and experience pain or discomfiture, as well as other sets of affective feeling like eroticism and creativity. And this, I think, is what it means to think of an architecture from the inside out, or from the starting place of the body. But not just the human body, the body conceived as one of many different kinds of organism that cohabit planet Earth. Now, you look at these two images, I'm sure you see evident formal similarities. There's no orthogonality, there's no straight walls or rectilinear surfaces. Instead, everything is doubly curved, and almost as if we're traveling through a keyhole surgery into another organism. And it may well have been that The Endless House by Frederick Kiesler was in the mind of RSC when they were designing the mosquito bottleneck project, which you see documented here, which is a house for multiple species, because the clients of this house, the inhabitants, are both human and also this mosquito. And the site of the house is a Caribbean site picked for its particular kind of insectoidal ecology, which is dominated in some respects by mosquito life. Well, rather than erase this other body as a foreigner or an alien, the mosquito house, in fact, treats the mosquito as a cohabitant. Now, the way it does so is by producing a double-skinned membrane. And you can see here that there's sort of an interior organism which exists within an exterior shell or skin. And this void that opens up between the two skins, this interstitial space, becomes the domus, the habitat of the mosquito, in which they're allowed to exist, and then human life takes place within that inner cocoon. Both species acknowledged, both species given kind of their own form of shelter, but also their necessary ecological separation for the preservation of life. It keeps the mosquitoes separate so they don't get swatted, and it stops the humans from being bitten. Well, this is really a different way of conceptualizing what architecture is, not just a home for the human, but instead an environmental surround for multi-species life to flourish. And this entails, this kind of new architectural attitude, entails a different conception of nature entirely. And our text, Architecture Without Nature by Timothy Morton, is a really key piece of thinking in order to disrupt any conventional notion of what nature is and its relationship to the human, in order for us to reframe the set of material relationships, the ecological context in which life takes place and in which buildings are built, and how buildings and architecture take account of life itself, and how a building recognizes or acknowledges or does not acknowledge and erases the forms of life which exist on a site. And I think this is, this is where we want to try and push, is how different can space be if we are truly inclusive in an ecological sense, if we take an excessive as opposed to a raising attitude towards life, if we think of ourselves as architects of a multi-species environment as opposed to a single species environment. How can that change the sorts of structures and forms that we produce when we design things? Well, let's just look into the Timothy Morton text to see if we can bring out some key concepts. And I think the first one is to first of all underline the unnaturalness of the concept of nature. And one of Morton's really key points is to say that nature is not something that, just like the body, is given or is found, but it's instead something which is constructed, and historically has been an idea that has been constructed by humans to suit the purpose of their own particular life, which in many cases has been simply to exploit the rest of life in order to advance the progress of humans, and that's happened in architecture as much as anywhere else. Well, instead of that attitude to nature, Morton asks us to think about living in a time of coexistence. That is, to think of ourselves as coexistent beings, cohabitants of the world, whose existence can't be separated from every other existent or life form. And this entails an acknowledgement that every life form is completely unique. Humans are unique as a life form, but not to the exclusion of other unique life forms. And this, to refer back to Haraway's idea of tentacularity and nets and networks of life, the web of life is a great figure of coexistence in Timothy Morton's thinking. Now, this also means if we take the idea that all life forms are unique, this also leads us to a theory of the monstrosity of existence. That is, not that we exist so much as species, which is a very generalizing tendency, but it's more like that the whole of life is a collection of monsters. Every entity, every individual life form, if you look at it closely enough, is a monster. It's unique, it's different, it has different characteristics from all other life forms. And respecting the monstrosity of each inhabitant of the world is what really constitutes an ecological view of reality as being irreductionist. That means not reducing the complexity and the uniqueness of every individual being to a species or a category, which you can make generalizations about, because in Morton's point of view, that's the first step to being able to kind of erase and push aside by overgeneralizing. Now, one further effect of this idea is that we take on a concept of affiliation between beings. So within the web of coexistence, every individual life monster has and exists by means of its affiliations to other monsters or life forms within that web. And its intimacy is what relates it in this web of affiliations. And because life and existence exists within this web or network, there is, as Tim Morton says, no yonder. There's no elsewhere. There's no kind of empty space where things could be dumped or sent to in order to get rid of them. And so this thinking is very much tied up in ideas of waste and energy. And Morton, characterizes the conventional idea of nature as having historically been thought of as a kind of dump, where where humans didn't exist, so you could dump everything in nature. Or alternatively, you could just take whatever you want from nature and then dump the stuff that you don't want back to it. Well, if you think of life itself as existing by means of affiliation in webs of life in which everything is linked to everything else in webs of intimacy, there is no yonder, there's no elsewhere where you can just throw your trash and forget about it. Now, to concretely imagine what such a space might be, Morton points to this fascinating work by RSC, the architect of the Mosquito House, and this project, Dusty Relief. And what's fascinating about this project is the facade system, which is produced out of electrostatic chainmail, that when electrified, gathers together all of the dust particles which exist in the atmosphere and builds up this kind of dirty fur over the facade, making a sort of protective insulatory layer around the internal program and massing. in order not to discharge its waste into the kind of nature and just dump it into some supposedly empty space, but to acknowledge that the fact of urban existence produces waste, and that waste can in fact be reappropriated by architecture as part of its ecology. So the architecture is living within its waste products. It's living more as an organism that is involved, a bit like the endless house, in these bodily cycles of nutrition and metabolism and waste. A highly conceptual project like the endless house, whose kind of energetic fields of interrelated life it clearly resembles. But this idea of there being a surrounding fur, a surrounding kind of ecological haze that wraps the building and binds it together in its interrelated tentacular proximity to the web of intimate affiliations that constitute ecological life. Such a conception of life is not actually out of the ordinary when we come to think about contemporary architecture, and we look at this amazing project by Stefano Boeri, the Bosco Verticale, the vertical forest, a constructed project in Milan. And you may know the project and how in other ways recognizable domestic tower block has been it kind of invites this living organic crust to grow on its balconies and produce a symbiotic membrane as its facade. That is a layer like a skin, its facade, which gives host to multiple species and multiple life forms rather than erasing them. And we get a sense from this of architecture producing wholly new forms of life and body. And what you're seeing here is footage of a documentary film which follows the work and life of abseiling gardeners, who are, as it were, a new species, a new kind of cyborgian body, part human, part vegetal, part mechanical with their ropes and straps and climbing apparatus, who effectively live out a new form of coexistence in the sky/architecture, in the sense that they are abseiling down the facade of the building, they're circulating and moving around this space in completely new ways. And their lives are defined through work that tends upon this new ecology. They make up a new economy between human and non-human life. And they become a bit like Kiesler inside of the Endless House. They become kind of insectoidal, just as the insects there benefit the overall ecology through their life within the vegetal atmosphere. The abseiling gardeners of the Bosco Verticale, they also benefit this life system and in order to produce a kind of equilibrium, a new form of kind of tentacularity. And I think that's a very interesting way for one to be able to approach architecture as something which gives birth to new kinds of life form. And, I would say what we start to see emerging within this context are more cyborgian, more multi-species versions of the human. If we look further at the work of Thomas Saraceno, we see other instances in which radical kinds of architectural form, radical kinds of materiality put into place and practice in architecture start also to produce new ecologies of relationship. And a lot of Thomas Saraceno's work has centered on the tentacular work of spiders. Spiders as weavers of cosmic webs. Spiders as it were, as architects. Some of nature's finest architects, whose webs produce on the minute, kind of microscopic scale, miniature versions of the web of interrelated cosmic life at the macro scale. And through extremely careful studies of these spider webs, Saraceno then redeploys similar kinds of spatial thinking on the scale of the membrane or the network in order to span spaces in completely new and radical ways, and ways in which, of course, then require the body, which require new bodies to emerge out of these spaces, new bodies and new ways of relating to one another, so that the individual body walking on these elastic tensile nets, like spiders, the body's weight and its disposition and its directionality is interfaced with other bodies. And so the very structural system of the architectural environment invites and produces new ways of living together, new forms of coexistence. So let's, to close out, let's return to Donna Haraway and another text that Haraway authored, Staying with the Trouble, which, interestingly contains on its front cover this composite being. And indeed, if one looks earlier back in Haraway's thinking, this is one of the covers from one of her early books from the 1980s, in which Haraway theorized the idea of the cyborg. Really interesting kind of diagrammatic, schematic picture of what a kind of tentacular being or a cyborgian being might look like, which is, a human entity, but one which is, living a symbiotic life with another animal identity. Their life spirits seem to be entwined together, but is also cyborgian in the sense of being part of an electromechanical network, all of which is situated within this cosmic surround. So Haraway's thought, as a historian and philosopher of science, is all about this construction of new versions of the human outside of its individualism, ways of linking it together with other species. And I should have said, just as a note here, when thinking of Kiesler, and I think we could say the same here of Saraceno's work, that they are both working in ways which bring them into contact as architects, as creators of space, with nature's architects, with the architectural, spatial, social systems that already exist in other points of the ecology. Here we're looking at the really extraordinary architecture of termite nests. these massively complicated, collectively produced, collectively constructed and assembled, kind of urbanisms, because they're nothing less than that, really. These under or above ground cities of the termites, in which amazing spatial complexity is produced through progressive and multitudinous tunneling by these small creatures. And I think key to sort of reinforce this, the proposition here is to, as it were, termite oneself, to tentacularize oneself, to insect oneself, to take up a different position in relationship to space and materiality, and to not only thereby generate sort of incredible new forms, but to produce spaces which are inhabitable to a wider section and more kind of inclusive portion of the highly diverse and excessive ecology in which all of our beings are suspended. Now, for Haraway, and this is where we'll come to a kind of conclusion. For Haraway, as she describes it, the task is to make kin in lines of inventive connection. And I think this is a very powerful formulation. Kin, of course, meaning, as in kinship, meaning to make relationships, to make families, but not families of exclusion, not families of erasure, not families of privilege, but to make kins of inventive connection, as a way of learning to live and die well with each other in a thick present. And by each other, she doesn't mean just other similarly enlightened human beings. She really means with other life forms, at whatever scale, whether they're the microorganismic scale or the scale of mammals. They are all kin. We are all related to them, and they all form, as it were, the clients of architecture, and their agencies are there and are involved and are affected by the decisions that we make on all levels of design as architects. And Haraway is very open about the fact, as we all know, that this work is to be done in troubled times. And I think this again raises the urgency of these architectural endeavors to respond to the ecological urgencies of our moment. And in Haraway's words, to stay with the trouble, to learn to be truly present, as mortal critters entwined in myriad unfinished configurations of places, times, matters, and meanings. And I think this is finally a kind of provocation to architecture to take on its role as a mortal critter, as an animal among other animals, entwined in myriad unfinished configurations. And I think if one is approaching architecture and the construction of space from a truly ecological point of view, there can be no more powerful brief than to go and work on the design of myriad unfinished configurations in which human life, in all of its ecological diversity, along with other life forms, non-human and biomechanical as they may be, is the great kind of goal of our moment. So thanks for listening. I look forward to seeing you in person and speaking more about these issues. Bye.